I think this should be seen as another step along the way to help Ukraine defend its own territory and, in an ideal world, be in a position on the battlefield of dominance that if we do get to the point of negotiations, the Ukrainians will be in a strong position to dictate some terms to Putin's Russia.
Well, so UK forces could be sent to Ukraine on a training mission. John Healey, the Defence Secretary, told The Times that the UK is looking to forge a new leadership role in the war against Russia. Speaking to the BBC yesterday, though, he rather swerved the question about the possibility of British boots on the ground in Ukraine. John Healey there. Let us talk to Lord Dannatt. General Lord Dannatt, the former head of the British Army. Richard, welcome to you.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon.
Good to have you here. Richard, what are your thoughts on the prospect of British forces training Ukrainian military in country? That would be a big statement, but an obvious risk.
Yes, there are obviously risks attached to that, but we know that we have been giving a tremendous amount of training to Ukraine and to Ukrainian soldiers here in the UK, and that is very useful. Of course, it could be argued that as opposed to bringing many thousands of Ukrainians to the UK to be trained, a relatively modest number of British trainers going to a safe part of Western Ukraine, or indeed possibly in Poland, would be logistically much more sensible and probably more cost efficient. So I think it's something perfectly reasonable that the government is looking at, but I think that's very different to using the rather provocative term, putting boots on the ground. That is implying that we're getting involved in Ukraine's fight in a direct sense. And that is not something the British government intends to do, nor would it be wise to do that. It would play entirely into Putin's agenda that this is NATO's war against Russia, which it most definitely is not. It's just us supporting Ukraine defend its sovereign territory.
Yeah, and clearly British ministers don't want to get British forces involved in direct conflict with the Russian military. But there's a big distinction, Richard, isn't there, between conducting training operations in Ukraine and even just a few miles away in Poland. If the work is done in Ukraine, it does present a risk. It does present the possibility of British soldiers coming into direct conflicts with Russians in one way or another.
Yes, it does. And being involved in the risk game is actually what soldiers, sailors and airmen take the King's shilling expect to do. So if it was decided that it was a sensible thing by our government to do, then soldiers would get on and do that. It should also be remembered that we've been assisting Ukraine for many years, particularly from 2014 after the illegal annexation of Crimea, and assisting Ukrainians with training in Ukraine. So this is not as completely a newer concept as is being mooted.
Yes.
So it just needs to be kept in mind. But it's very, very different from UK troops getting involved in Ukraine's fight. No, we're not. We're simply continuing the actions that we've been taking steadfastly to support Ukraine defend itself from Russian aggression.
I just wonder how blurred the line is between training and fighting. I mean, clearly they're two different kinds of operations, but if a training operation or a training base is a target for Russia, well, the question of defence against the Russian attack arises, and if British forces are there, well, would they not be at least likely to get involved in that? There'd need to be rules of engagement, which would have to be very, very carefully considered.
Of course, rules of engagement are absolutely fundamental to any military operation that we get involved in. I think were the government to decide that it was sensible and wise to send British training teams to Western Ukraine, sort of Lviv sort of area, then they would have to satisfy themselves that the force protection measures were adequate and were sensible. And within those force protection measures were rules of engagement to allow British troops to defend themselves. The main threat, of course, would be missile, drone, and air attack.
Yes.
You wouldn't see a ground force getting anywhere near them in Western Ukraine.
No, but you might see air attack, in which case anti-aircraft operations come into play. You know, could we then see British forces engaged in firing upon Russian aircraft, for example, or NATO or British aircraft getting involved in engaging those Russian aircraft, because that takes us into a whole new area with all sorts of political and strategic complications.
John, you're absolutely right, and these will be exactly the factors that John Healey and the senior officials in the Ministry of Defence will be weighing up. But I think it's worth saying that at almost every stage since February 2022, commentators have agonized about this escalation or that escalation, and eventually have taken decisions to give more and more capable weapons to the Ukrainians, take restrictions off using things like Storm Shadow at their maximum range. And it hasn't provoked the reaction from Russia that people perhaps had feared. So I think this should be seen as another step along the way to help Ukraine defend its own territory, and in an ideal world, be in a position on the battlefield of dominance that if we do get to the point of negotiations, the Ukrainians will be in a strong position to dictate some terms to Putin's Russia.
Well, let's look ahead for a moment at the possibility of peace talks and the terms of that peace. In your own view, Richard, do you believe that UK forces could or should play a part, as Donald Trump's team seems to be suggesting, according to the Wall Street Journal, in a European operation to guard what would be a demilitarized zone between the Ukrainian and Russian lines as part of that deal?
Well, it's a very interesting thought, isn't it? It's quite a challenging thought as far as the Ministry of Defence is concerned. I think, though, that this would only come about if both parties on the Ukrainian side and the Russian side were willing to allow a multinational force to patrol a demilitarized zone, and that multinational force to include other European contingents, such as French, German, and British. But it's worth just reflecting on. And how many times have we talked about how small the British Army is today? If we were to take over a sector of that 800-kilometre front line, let's say Britain became responsible for 100 kilometres of that 800-kilometre front line, we would need really quite a sizable force, probably 5,000 to 10,000 soldiers to adequately contain that 100 kilometres. If we're going to deploy that sort of force, we'll be doing it on an enduring basis, so it would need 4 times that number. And my goodness, we quite quickly run out of soldiers. So I think this is something that the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Defence will be quite wary of getting into. It might sound wonderful to say, yes, if the Russians allow it, we'll put a British contingent in. But my goodness, it would strain the Ministry of Defence. And then they'd have to really think about increasing the amount of money spent on defence. Forget 2.5, go through 3% to 3.5%. And then we're talking.
Yeah, well, that sort of increase in defence spending as a proportion of national earnings, that is apparently being considered inside MOD circles. However, discussion then for another day. And so it should be.
So it should be.
Okay, Lord Dannatt, former head of the British Army, great to get your thoughts as always.
Thanks, John.
Very good to welcome you again back here. Very important we're able to show our continued commitment and support for Ukraine in this such important fight for you and for all of us as well. So very good to welcome you back to go through plans to talk in more detail about the work we can do together.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister.